Isolde Rourke woke to the smell of salt and gun oil, and for 3 full seconds she could not remember why the man beside the door had blood on his knuckles. The lighthouse cottage on the point at Sable Cove was supposed to be quiet at this hour. It was 2 nights after the wedding, a wedding that had lasted 11 minutes and ended with a handshake instead of a kiss, and she had gone to sleep in a spare room with her wedding ring still unfamiliar on her finger, married to a boat mechanic she had known for exactly 19 days. Now there were 2 men unconscious on the kitchen floor, a third groaning against the wood stove, and Bastien Vos standing over all 3 of them without a single hair out of place, Marnie asleep and unbothered against his shoulder, as if her father hauled armed strangers out of the house every week of her small life. "Get away from the window," he said, and his voice had none of the easy roughness she'd gotten used to over the last 3 weeks. It was flat, efficient, a voice built for exactly this. "Bastien. Window." She moved. Later she would try to explain to herself why she'd obeyed a man she barely knew instead of asking a single question, and the only honest answer she'd ever land on was that some part of her animal brain had already understood, before her conscious mind caught up, that the man she'd married for a business contract was not, and had never been, only a mechanic. But that understanding came later. First, there was 3 weeks earlier, and a law office on the 41st floor of a glass tower on Bay Street that smelled like leather and old money, and faintly of her father's cologne, though her father was 2 kilometers away in a hospital bed and hadn't set foot in that boardroom in 5 months. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded through 3 lawyers before it reached Isolde's desk, and it had taken her most of the afternoon to understand that her grandfather, dead 11 years, a man who'd built halcyon tidal energy out of a garage in Digby with 2 patents and a stubborn streak nobody in the family had ever managed to outlast, had built a trap into the company's founding trust that nobody had bothered to read closely until now. "It's called a continuity clause," said Desmond Halloran, the family's estate lawyer, sliding a folder across a desk that had probably cost more than Isolde's mortgage. He was a careful, silver-templed man who had drafted 3 generations of Rourke paperwork and looked, this particular Tuesday, like he would rather have been doing almost anything else. In the event that company leadership passes to an unmarried principal during a hostile acquisition attempt, voting control of the founding shares reverts to the board chair until such time as I get married, Isolde said. "My grandfather wrote a marriage clause into a renewable energy trust in 1981. "Your grandfather," said Halloran, "did not trust boards. He wasn't wrong to have not trusted them." Isolde had spent 4 months watching Anders Kessler, chair of the board, and the man who had been circling Halcyon since her father's heart gave out in April, court a hostile buyer with the patience of a man who had already picked out where to hang the acquisition photo. If the clause triggered, Kessler would have 60 days of unchecked voting control, more than enough time to push the sale through before Malcolm Rourke was well enough to stop him, if he ever was. "There has to be another way to satisfy it." "There is a provision," said the woman beside Halloran, sharp-jawed, unsmiling, introduced only as Renata Cho, "for an arranged marriage that meets the legal threshold. It doesn't require love, Ms. Rourke. It requires a marriage certificate, cohabitation that would withstand scrutiny, and 2 years before the shares fully vest back to you outright." "You want me to marry a stranger?" "We want you," Cho said, "to keep your father's company." Isolde had built a career on saying no to bad terms. She said no to underwriters who padded numbers, no to investors who wanted a board seat and a say in things that weren't theirs, to say anything about no once, to a merger that would have made her personally very rich and put 400 people out of work. She had never once, in 38 years, said yes to something this absurd. She thought about her father's hands, how they used to smell like machine grease before Halcyon got big enough that he wore a suit instead of coveralls, how he'd take her out on the test barges off Digby when she was 7 and let her hold the little multimeter like it was a real job. She thought about the 400 people and the 600 more the company employed now, and the tidal turbines humming quietly under the Bay of Fundy that her grandfather had bet his whole life on when everyone told him the currents would tear his prototypes apart within a season. "Who?" she said. "Is he?" Halloran and Cho exchanged a look that told her everything before either of them opened their mouths. "His name is Bastien Vos," Halloran said carefully. "He's private, lives out on the South Shore. Runs a boat repair operation out of Sable Cove, a mechanic, a very good one, from what I understand. Why him? Because he asked for almost nothing," Cho said, which was, Isolde would learn much later, the first and possibly only outright lie either of them told her that day. She met him on a Thursday, on a dock that smelled like diesel and low tide, and her first thought, unbidden, unwelcome, was that he did not look like a man who needed a stranger's money. He looked like a man who had made peace with not having very much of it a long time ago and had stopped noticing the absence. "You're the CEO," he said. "Not a question. You're the mechanic. For now." He wiped his hands on a rag that had clearly given up being clean sometime in the previous decade and looked at her with an attention that made her feel, unfairly, like she was the one being assessed for structural soundness. Halloran explained the terms. 2 years. We live together. We show up when it's required. It ends cleanly, and in exchange you save your father's company. He said it without inflection, but something in his jaw tightened. Must be nice. Having something worth doing this for. Do you not? He looked past her, out toward the gray water, and for a second, just a second, something moved behind his eyes that she wouldn't understand for another 6 weeks. "I've got a 5-year-old who needs a school with actual funding and a life that doesn't fall apart if I break an ankle on a bad engine job. That's worth quite a lot to me, Ms. Rourke Isolde. He tested the name like a tool he wasn't sure was the right size for the job. "Bastien. You'll want to meet Marnie before you sign anything. She's the one you're actually moving in with. I'm just the guy who comes with her." She had expected, if she was honest, someone rougher. Someone who would treat the arrangement like a windfall. What she got instead was a man who negotiated harder on his daughter's behalf than on his own, who asked more questions about the school district near the Toronto condo than about the size of the signing payment, and who signed the final papers with a pen that clearly wasn't his, in handwriting that looked like it belonged to someone who'd once written a great deal more than boat repair invoices. She noticed that. She filed it away and didn't ask, because asking things she couldn't afford to know felt, at the time, like the safer choice. The wedding took 11 minutes at a registry office in Halifax, attended by Halloran, Cho, and a 5-year-old in a dress with butterflies on it, who informed everyone solemnly that she was going to be the flower girl, even though nobody had asked her to be. No kiss. They'd agreed on that beforehand briskly, over a phone call that had lasted 90 seconds, a handshake instead, brief and businesslike. And Isolde had gone home that night to a condo on the 32nd floor with a man she'd known for 19 days, and a little girl clutching a stuffed seal who fell asleep against Isolde's shoulder on the drive up from the harbor before either of the adults had said a single unnecessary word to each other. "She likes you already," Bastien said, watching in the rearview mirror. "That's either very good or very bad. Marnie doesn't warm up slow. Which is it? Ask me in 2 years." The first month settled into something that looked, from the outside, almost ordinary. Isolde ran halcyon out of the Bay Street office by day, fielding Kessler's increasingly transparent maneuvering with the particular exhaustion of someone playing chess against a man who kept accusing her of cheating whenever she won a piece. Bastien, it turned out, hadn't given up the boatyard. He split his week between Sable Cove and the city, and on the nights he was in Toronto he cooked dinner with a competence that suggested this, too, was not new to him, and put Marnie to bed with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything, and said almost nothing about himself that Isolde could later verify. It was Marnie who cracked the silence first, the way children do, without meaning to. "Daddy used to have a different house," she announced, one evening, over macaroni, apropos of absolutely nothing. "A big one. With a boat that wasn't broken, Marnie. It's true, Auntie Priya said so." Isolde looked at Bastien. Bastien looked very deliberately at his plate. "Who's Priya?" "Nobody," he said, in a tone that made it extremely clear she was somebody, and changed the subject with the smooth efficiency of a man who had done this exact maneuver a great many times before. She let it go. She had a hostile board chair circling her company, and a father who still couldn't string together a full sentence some mornings, and she told herself, reasonably, that everyone was entitled to a past they didn't want to explain to a woman they'd married for tax purposes, and a trust clause. But Priya turned up 2 weeks later at the harbor house in Sable Cove, a compact woman with watchful eyes who was introduced only as a friend, who scanned every room she entered before she sat down in it, and who looked at Isolde over dinner with an expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite pity. "You care about him," Priya said later on the porch while Bastien put Marnie to bed inside. "That's not really what this is. Didn't ask what it was. Said what I saw." Priya turned her glass of water in her hands. "Cross, Bastien doesn't let people that close, hasn't in 6 years. If you're in this house, in his kitchen, close enough that his kid calls you by name instead of Dad's friend, then you matter more than you think you do. Which means you should probably know what you're standing next to." "What am I standing next to?" Priya only smiled, thin and unreadable, and went back inside, and Isolde stood alone on the porch with the tide going out and the distinct, cold feeling that she had married into something considerably larger than a boat repair business. The gala came at the end of the second month. Halcyon's annual investor dinner, black tie. Every executive expected to arrive with a spouse whose presence would either calm the room or set it talking, and Kessler had made sure everyone on the invite list knew Isolde Rourke had married in secret and hadn't yet produced her husband in public. "I don't do galas," Bastian said when she told him. "You do now? You're my husband. If you're not there, people will ask exactly the kind of questions we can't afford." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that poke holes in the story." He looked at her for a long moment, something calculating behind the reluctance. "Fine, one night. We leave the second it's socially acceptable. Deal." "And Bastian, try to look like you don't want to throw someone through a window. No promises." He wore the suit like he'd worn one before, which she noted and again did not ask about. He was good in the room in a way that surprised her. Quiet, watchful, unbothered by Kessler's pointed comments about new money finding its footing, answering personal questions with just enough charm to close the subject without opening another one. Halfway through the evening, Kessler cornered her near the bar, his smile doing nothing to soften the threat underneath it. "Whoever he is," Kessler said, glancing across the room to where Bastian stood in quiet conversation with a nervous young analyst, "he's very well trained for a man who fixes outboard motors. Careful, Ms. Rourke. Some men marry up, others marry in for reasons that have nothing to do with love." "Is that a threat, Mr. Kessler?" "It's advice. From someone who's watched this company a great deal longer than you have." She didn't tell Bastian what Kessler had said. She told herself it was because it wasn't worth repeating. The truer reason was that some small, unexamined part of her was afraid he'd confirm it. The weeks after the gala brought a strange, dangerous kind of normalcy. He started joining them for breakfast on the Toronto mornings instead of leaving early for the boatyard. She started coming home before 8 instead of 9, telling herself it was for Marnie's bedtime, knowing it wasn't only that. There was an evening in October when he fixed the radiator in the harbor house himself, instead of calling someone, grease up to his elbows, and she stood in the doorway with 2 cups of tea and thought, with a clarity that frightened her, that she had stopped counting the days until this arrangement ended. It was that same week the fight happened. "It feels like we're building something," she said, standing in the kitchen with the radiator ticking as it cooled. "Something real, and you keep acting like we're not." His jaw tightened, the way it did when a conversation strayed somewhere he didn't want to go. "This isn't real, Isolde. It's a legal arrangement that got complicated. When are you going to stop pretending you don't feel it too? When are you going to remember this has an expiry date?" The words landed like something physical. She stood very still. "You're right," she said finally, quiet and even. "It's temporary. In 2 years I'll have my company back, and you and Marnie will go back to wherever you're actually from, and we'll both pretend none of this happened. Isolde." "I'm tired, Bastian. Good night." She made it to the guest room before the tears came and hated herself for them, for crying over a contract with a man who had told her, from the very first dock conversation, exactly how temporary he intended this to be. 2 weeks of careful, awful politeness followed. They moved through the condo like tenants in the same building, rather than people who slept 2 doors apart, and it was Marnie, of course, who noticed first. "Why don't you and Daddy talk anymore?" she asked one night while Isolde was braiding her hair before bed. "We talk, sweetheart, not like before. You're both sad and quiet now. Adults are complicated, Marnie." "That's a boring answer," Marnie said, with the devastating honesty of the very young, and went back to arranging her stuffed seal's tiny sweater, and Isolde sat on the edge of the bed and thought that the 5-year-old had a point. The truth came out on a night in November, not gently, but the way most truths that matter do, under pressure with no good options left. Kessler's takeover attempt accelerated faster than anyone had modeled. A key enterprise contract with Halcyon's largest turbine buyer collapsed overnight, poached, according to the board's best intelligence, by a shell company with no discernible history and an address that traced back, after 3 days of digging by Isolde's general counsel, to a numbered corporation controlled, 3 layers down, by a man named Anders Kessler Sr., not the board chair, his father. A man Isolde had never heard of, and Bastian, when she said the name across the dinner table, went very, very still. "Say that again, Kessler. Senior. Why?" He set down his fork. Looked at Marnie, who was absorbed in her macaroni and out of earshot in the way only small children reliably are, and then looked at Isolde with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not guarded for once, but tired in a way that went down to the bone. "Because 30 years ago," he said quietly, "Anders Kessler Sr. stole a set of tidal turbine patents from a marine engineer in Digby, forged the transfer paperwork, and when the engineer wouldn't stay quiet about it, arranged for the lab where he worked to have an electrical fault that nobody ever properly investigated. The engineer's name was Elias Sorensen. A pause. He was my father. Isolde sat with that for a long moment, the kitchen suddenly very loud, with the small ordinary sounds of Marnie's fork against her plate. Your name isn't Voss. It's my late wife's name. Seraphine's. I took it after my father died because Kessler Sr.'s people made it very clear that anyone still using the name Sorensen and asking questions about that lab fire tended not to stay healthy for long. Voss let me disappear. Let Marnie grow up without a target on her back. He rubbed a hand over his face. I'm not just a mechanic, Isolde. I never fully stopped being the man who inherited what was left of my father's claim on those patents. There's money, not much I ever touch, held in trust, managed by people who are very good at making sure it can't be traced back to Sable Cove. I told myself it didn't matter anymore. That the past was the past, and now his son is trying to take my company. Using technology, Bastien said, that my father invented and never got credit for. Your grandfather bought those patents in good faith from a corporation that had already stolen them. He never knew. I don't think he'd have touched it if he had. Does Kessler know who you are? I don't know, but if his father's people are circling Halcyon, and I'm living in your house with your name attached to mine now. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She should have been angrier. She would examine that later and be a little unsettled by how little anger there actually was. Mostly there was a kind of vertigo, the sense of a floor she'd been standing on turning out to be a door all along. But underneath the vertigo was something steadier. She believed him. Every strange gap in his story, every unexplained skiffle, every flicker behind his eyes when she'd mentioned Kessler's name at the gala, it all resolved finally into a shape that made sense. So the question, he said, watching her carefully, is whether it changes anything. She thought about her father in his hospital bed, 600 jobs, the turbines humming under the Bay of Fundy on a technology built on a stolen inheritance neither of them had known about until tonight. She thought about 2 months of dinners and one radiator, and a 5-year-old who called her by her first name now instead of Dad's wife. No, she said, doesn't change anything. But it means we're not fighting Kessler for the same reasons anymore. We're fighting him for the same reason. Something in his shoulders loosened, fractionally like a held breath finally let go. That was Tuesday. By Thursday night, the men were in the kitchen. Priya's crew, 4 of them, it turned out, quietly rotating shifts around the harbor house for longer than Isolde had realized, caught 2 of the 3 intruders before they'd fully cleared the mudroom. The third made it as far as the kitchen, where Bastien, roused from sleep in under 4 seconds and moving like a man for whom this was simply a category of Tuesday night problem, put him on the floor without breaking stride and without waking his daughter, who slept on against his shoulder through the entire thing with the boneless trust of a child who has never once doubted her father could handle whatever came through the door. Local muscle, Priya said afterward, crouched over the groaning man by the wood stove, while 2 RCMP officers who clearly already knew Priya by name took statements in the front hall. Hired, not Kessler's people directly, but hired by someone who wanted to know how much you 2 knew and whether Marnie was worth using as leverage. Her jaw tightened. That's new. That's Kessler Sr. getting desperate. Or Kessler Jr., Isolde said, getting told by his father exactly who I married. By morning, Halloran had the paperwork Isolde needed. The original unaltered patent transfer records that Bastien's protection team had spent 6 years quietly assembling, tucked in a safety deposit box. Priya finally admitted to knowing about proof enough of the original forgery to make Anders Kessler Sr.'s decades-old theft a matter for federal fraud investigators rather than a footnote nobody could touch. It didn't erase what had happened to Elias Sorensen. Nothing would. But it meant that when Isolde walked into an emergency board session 4 days later with her father, thin, tired, but upright, discharged against doctor's orders for exactly this occasion, beside her she had more than a marriage certificate to defend her company with. You knew, Anders Kessler said, across the boardroom table, his composure cracking for the first time in 5 months, that your husband is Elias Sorensen's son. I know now, Isolde said. I also know your father forged a patent transfer in 1994 and had a lab fire covered up to keep it quiet. The Federal Fraud Office knows that too, as of this morning. So the real question, Mr. Kessler, is whether you'd like to resign from this board today or whether you'd like to explain to your own shareholders next week why your family name is attached to a 30-year-old cover-up. Kessler didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He was gone from the board by the following Monday, and the continuity clause, satisfied and then some, quietly reverted full voting control to Isolde 3 weeks ahead of schedule, once Malcolm Rourke's lawyers finished confirming there was, in fact, no further threat requiring it. Winter came to Sable Cove hard and early that year, The harbor choked with the kind of cold that made the boats groan at their moorings, and it was on one of those gray afternoons, with Marnie building a fort out of couch cushions on the living room floor, that she asked the question that had apparently been sitting in her 5-year-old mind for some time. Are you and Daddy going to have a real wedding? With cake and everything? We're already married, Marnie. That was the pretend kind. I mean the real kind. Where people wear nice clothes and there's cake and everyone cries because they're happy. From the doorway, Bastian's voice, low and unhurried. That's a good question. Isolde looked up. He was leaning against the frame in a flannel shirt with sawdust on one sleeve, watching the two of them with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something unguarded, almost soft, the look of a man who had spent 6 years keeping every door in himself locked, and had finally, without quite meaning to, left one open. Are we? He asked. Are we what? Getting married for real. Cake, nice clothes, all of it. He crossed the room and crouched by the couch fort, close enough that Marnie abandoned her cushions entirely to climb into his lap. The clause is satisfied. The company's safe. Kessler's gone. There's no contract left requiring either of us to stay in this. Isolde, I know. I'd like to stay anyway. Not because of a trust clause. Not because of a company. Because somewhere in the last 4 months, you stopped being the CEO I signed papers with and became someone I actually want across the table from me at breakfast. Both of us do. He glanced down at Marnie, who was already bouncing with the particular urgency of a child sensing a decision about to be made without her input. Say yes, Marnie said. Say yes, say yes, say yes. Isolde looked at the two of them, this man who had spent 6 years disappearing to keep his daughter safe and had somehow, in a fishing town on the South Shore, ended up rebuilding a life worth being found for. This child who had decided, with the uncomplicated certainty only the very young possess, that Isolde belonged in it, and understood that she had been given, entirely by accident, everything she hadn't known to ask for when she walked into a law office on Bay Street, expecting nothing more than a way to save her father's company. Yes, she said. Bastian smiled, not the careful, measured expression he'd worn through boardrooms and galas, but something wide open and unguarded, the smile of a man setting something down he'd been carrying a long time. No poofy dress, Isolde added, and nowhere near a registry office again. Somewhere here. The harbor, maybe, if it's not frozen solid. Priya will want to run a security sweep on the entire waterfront. Priya can run whatever she wants. She's earned an invitation, after everything. Outside, the tide was going out over Sable Cove the way it always did, indifferent and steady, and inside the little house on the point, a 5-year-old was already narrating, at considerable volume, exactly how many flowers she intended to carry down the aisle.